More about these reforms, I sat down with Eric Farnsworth, the Vice President of the Council of Americas and the Americas Society, and I asked him, why now?
Well, this is an issue that President Bachelet ran on for her re-election last year, and it's a signature issue for her that she really needs to get through, which is to say education reform. That's been an issue that has really challenged Chile for some time, led to a number of street protests, a lot of political discussion, if you want to put it that way. But in order to make those reforms, you have to pay for them somehow. And in a slowing economy that Chile is going through currently, as are many countries in South America, you have to find ways to raise revenue that don't unduly harm the macroeconomy, but still mobilizing new resources to pay for these education reforms. So it's a really difficult place where she is, and it takes a lot of political negotiation and compromise, and that's exactly what we're seeing right now in Chile.
I mean, you're saying it very nicely, but this has been controversial. This hasn't been a very easy thing to push through.
It's very controversial.
The controversy, I'm going to refer specifically to the corporate tax increase, because that's something that obviously most companies are going to say, hey, wait a minute. How much is too much? Is it too much, or is this the right amount?
Well, I think that's for the Chilean people to decide, but the truth of the matter is, if you talk to the private sector in Chile, a lot of them will say, yeah, this is kind of necessary. We don't like taxes, nobody likes taxes, but we recognize that the Chilean education system does need to be improved. The question is, can you strike a balance? Can you raise the resources that are necessary without going too far, without discouraging the investment that's required? And remember, Chile is a commodities-based country. Primarily copper exports is what the economy has grown on. That is hugely capital intensive. That requires a large amount of investment from abroad, from Chile as well. So if you take steps that discourage that investment, what you're really doing is saying that over time your macroeconomy has the potential to grow less. That's something that causes a lot of people a little bit of concern. Having said that, again, there is a balance, and the private sector in Chile has been a responsible player, and I think for the most part they might grumble and say that they don't want to pay them, but they will in the end.
You talked about the macroeconomy overall, and I can't help but think about some of the inflation issues that have affected Latin America for some time, and it's still a very major concern. The individuals, the average person, wages are not high, despite what we see on television of all these glass buildings. The vast majority of folks in Latin America, Chile is not an exception, still live, very modestly. They're saying that these taxes or tax increases will ultimately help them. How will they do that?
Well, it depends on how the tax mix ultimately comes out. In other words, do you raise corporate taxes and lower personal taxes? And to the extent that personal individual taxes are lowered, sure, then individuals will be helped by that. But I think you have to look at this also in the broader perspective, which is to say that in Chile, like many other countries in Latin America, if you're a part of the broader elite or a certain segment of society, you're going to get your education, you're going to have opportunities, you're going to have a future that, if you want it to be, can be pretty bright. What the education reforms and other social reforms are doing is trying to make those opportunities available to everybody who hasn't necessarily had the access to those opportunities in the past. So it's those people who may have been marginalized, who may not have had the same opportunities, particularly through education, whose lives could directly be impacted in a positive way with these reforms.
Two questions. One, your greatest concern about not just these reforms, but ongoing for Chile as an economy right now?
Well, I think Chile still is a commodities-based economy, and that means that they have to export their commodities to other markets, primarily China. And so to the extent China slows, that's going to hit Chile's economy. The good news is that this is not a surprise for Chileans. They've been preparing for this for some time. They've been trying to diversify the economy. They've put together a rainy day fund. But still, the reality is it's something that the country still remains dependent on the commodities trade. So you do need to see a diversification there. That's something that I think a lot of people are looking at.
And the one thing in these reforms that you would add to, perhaps?
Well, it's tough for me to give advice to the Chilean political system. I think it's something that if you talk to the left or the right in Chile, and we have to remember that is a fairly narrow construct, because Chile is not like other countries in Latin America. The politics are really in a fairly narrow and centrist defined place. But we have to recognize that, like we've seen all over Latin America, that politics has to deliver results for the people. In other words, your lives have to improve under democracy. Otherwise, people will look for alternatives. I'm not concerned that that's an issue in Chile. It is an issue for more countries in Latin America, but it is something that President Bachelet has spoken about recently. It's one reason why she's so adamant about the need for education reforms and other reforms. And it's one reason, I think, also why, frankly, the private sector and other people whose taxes are going up are willing to consider that because they recognize the broader implications of the whole reform program.
Thanks to Eric Farnsworth, Vice President, Council of the Americas and America's Society.